The graves of more than 8,000 American soldiers near the border between the Netherlands and Belgium symbolize Europe's long-standing reliance on the United States for its security. 80 years after the country was liberated from Nazi Germany, the site remains a monument to freedom. And that's why local politicians are opposing a visit by US President Donald Trump to the cemetery in June.
The President, Mr. Trump, at this moment is not the right person to be here to celebrate with us our liberation, because of all the statements he's making at this moment about democracy, about freedom.
A historically deep connection has soured just weeks into Donald Trump's second term.
The European Union was formed in order to screw the United States.
A speech by Vice President J.D. Vance in Munich alarmed European leaders.
In Britain and across Europe, free speech, I fear, is in retreat.
But real panic set in after this meeting between Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country.
For Europe, the message was clear. For the first time in 8 decades, it is on its own. In just 100 days, Donald Trump has shaken up the post-World War II order in which Europe felt secure and thrived for 80 years. While European leaders are struggling to respond, many wonder if Trump's actions are a disaster for Europe or a blessing in disguise.
He's a disaster for Europe because we've had very, very strong relations. Not uncomplicated, but strong. Now he's throwing us under the bus. So it's a big shock, but it's also a chance, because we must continue on our own strength.
To build this strength, the EU plans to spend billions of dollars on boosting its defense. Germany has even changed its constitution to allow more military expenditure.
We're moving in the right direction, but turning financial budget decisions into real capabilities, into hardware that's actually rolling on the ground or flying in the air, of course it takes years. In the long term, I'm quite optimistic that we can do it. In the short term, our dependence on the US is real and urgent.
With 51% of Europeans now viewing Donald Trump as an enemy of Europe, and despite its history of divisions, the continent is rallying. A recent poll shows that 74% of EU citizens believe the Union benefits their country, the highest number since it was founded. Vaessen, Al Jazeera, near the Dutch-Belgian border.
We're going to cross now to Brussels, and we're joined by Al Jazeera's Hashim Al-Bara. Hashim, as we've got a sense of there, it seems like the entire US-European relationship has basically been turned upside down since Trump came into office. Is that how it feels there?
That's exactly the feeling here in Europe. Tom, the EU has been built on 2 key fundamentals, which is free trade and the Transatlantic alliance with the United States of America. And they saw that for decades. They were reaping the fruit of that alliance, which is basically translated into prosperity and stability. Now, that belief has been shaken to the core with the Trump administration, who was talking in contempt about European values, particularly liberal democracy, who threatened to pull out from Europe, who described European leaders as free riders, and he said that America is not going to provide any further assistance in the near future, particularly the military assistance. And who also said that the entire alliance is in doubt. What does that mean for Europeans? More anxiety? They were preparing for that change, but they never thought that this could be a huge change in Europe. And this explains why they are trying now to work out contingency plans for the upcoming years, particularly throughout the mandate of Donald Trump, but at the same time beyond the Donald Trump mandate. But the general consensus now in Europe that the tariffs, the threats of pulling out from Europe, Trump's push to negotiate a settlement with Russia are strong indications that it's about time for them to put things into order and move independently.
And Hashim, how well have European leaders dealt with all of this? Can you just run us through what they've tried to do to mitigate some of the risks and uncertainty that Trump has thrown up?
So this is basically, Tom, what they are trying to do. They think that a rushed deal with Russia on Ukraine is going to further embolden Putin to expand his military influence and potentially maybe invade another country. And this is where they said we will have to lift the restrictions that we put in place for decades on defense spending. They're spending like they never did before, particularly now that they are going to be led by Germany, which has paved the way for massive defense spending because they want to be independent during Trump, but also after the Trump mandate. Number two, they are looking for alternative allies, and this explains why they have been sending senior European leaders to China to talk with the Chinese, who have decided recently to lift some of the sanctions imposed on European leaders. There's going to be a EU-China summit in June, trying to figure out how to mitigate the impact of the tariffs imposed by Trump, but at the same time to try to explore the potential for stronger EU-China relations. This is unprecedented. This was not the narrative of the Europeans or the Chinese themselves about a month ago. But I think because of Trump, they decided that they are in the midst of a new geopolitical order, and therefore they have to brace for massive changes. Otherwise, the repercussions are going to be huge. Finally, Tom, this is a Europe that understands that against the backdrop of inflation, the repercussions from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and also the economic problems it faces, this could be a turning point for Europe, and therefore this explains the huge level of anxiety that you feel across Europe about if they decide tomorrow to turn the chapter of that transatlantic alliance with the United States of America. Will Europe itself change, or to what extent that change will look like in the near future?
Hashim, as always, thank you so much. Hashim Al-Bara for us in Brussels. The United States is the European Union's largest partner for exports and its second largest for imports. Eurostat figures show the EU exported goods worth more than $600 billion to the US last year, while the US sent goods worth more than $370 billion to the bloc. In 2024, the US trade deficit with the EU was $236 billion. That's according to the Office of the US Trade Representative. Europe's defence relies heavily on the US. Washington provided 64% of the weapons imported European NATO members between 2020 and 2024. Now, to reduce dependency on the US, the European Commission has proposed increasing defence spending by more than $800 million. The bloc is also looking to strike free trade agreements with a number of other countries. Well, Theresa Fallon is the director of the Centre for Russia-Europe-Asia Studies. She joins us from Brussels. Thanks very much for being with us here on Al Jazeera. First of all, can you just give us an overview, a bit of an idea of how deeply Trump's moves so far have shaken Europe?
Well, first we had the Putin shock with the invasion of Ukraine, and that didn't seem to shake up Europe enough. And now we have the Trump shock. So it seems that Europe is responding. They've been rather delinquent on promises of investing in defense. Every member of NATO had agreed to a 10 years ago to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. And that has only happened rather recently in regard to the invasion of Ukraine. So we see 6 countries still haven't even reached that point, even though there's a war on the continent. So I think that Europeans have been very, very slow to invest in their own defense. So they have been accused, and this is where Trump does get it right, of cheap riding or free riding on the US. So it's an alliance, not just kind of a babysitting club. And it has been long discussed that Europe needs to more justly do burden sharing, because the U.S. was trying to focus more on China. And Europe has really been reluctant to do that. So I think that this Trump shock has really had an effect. But we've seen a growth of populism in Europe across the board. And although there's a lot of grandstanding talking about how much they're going to spend on defense, we heard about this 4 years ago, almost 4 years ago, with Scholz on the invasion of Ukraine. Chancellor of Germany talked about a Zeitenwende and how things had changed, and that they would spend more money on defense. And that really has not happened. So we're hoping that with the new Chancellor Merz that there will really be spending. But we're already seeing the AfD, a very large right-wing party in Germany, is kind of pro-Russia, and they don't want to spend on defense. So it's nice to make all these statements. And I just was recently in Italy for a study trip, and the Rearm Europe campaign put out by European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, there's already a backlash against that in Italy, saying, the public says, why we don't want to spend on weapons, we want to spend on education. So I don't know how smoothly this transition will be. And there's a good decade that Europe will be exposed. If the US pulls back, they haven't invested in their defense space enough that it will take at least 10 years to get things going.
Yes.
So there is a lot of grandstanding, but we'll have to wait to see how things really do work out.
I want to pick up on something that you mentioned there. It's just been announced that China will lift sanctions on EU lawmakers to potentially unlock a trade deal. How significant is this? And could we see more moves by the EU to try and find alternatives to the US?
I woke up to this news. It was incredible. There were many rumors that this was going on, that the Chinese were secretly lobbying in Parliament because there were rules against that since the sanctions were placed on European members of the European Parliament. This is happening in parallel to the Huawei illegal lobbying campaign. And this is kind of the tip of the iceberg about Chinese influence activities within the European Parliament. So China is on a charm offensive. They see a big opportunity here. As in your news package, there is a great dissatisfaction with the Trump administration. Many in Europe see the US now as an adversary. So it's ripe for the picking. It's China's dream to throw a wedge in the transatlantic relationship, and they see this opportunity. Because for years, the comprehensive agreement on investment was put into the deep freeze, and no one was willing to move, neither Europe nor China. The fact that China decided to lift the sanctions on the MEPs shows how sincere they are in wanting to get this trade deal off the ground. But Europe should think very carefully about this. Is it really smart to become more dependent on China? Are they just replacing another dependency? Because there's been loads of discussion about fears of China dumping more and more electric vehicles, other products inside Europe, because the US has a lot of tariffs up that, so China will be looking for alternative markets. And there's not even a defense discussion on how this kind of EV electric vehicles, for example, in China, several years ago, it was announced that any Tesla owner in China was not allowed to drive near any Chinese military installations because of the electronics in the car. It can pick up a lot of data information. But Europe isn't even thinking about this at this time. No. And there will be a tsunami of electric vehicles coming into the market.
OK, Theresa, we'll have to leave it there, but we really do appreciate your time and your insight, Theresa Fallon, for us in Brussels.
Thank you.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.